Welcome back. Let's start a new section of videos, and in this particular section we're going to focus on one of the most basic of services within Azure, and that's Azure Storage. And I say it's one of the most basic because not only is it one of the three pillars of infrastructure as a service, which of course is what we're talking about in this series, but it's also a basis for a lot of the platform as a service features and services that Azure provides. For example, Azure SQL, of course, is going to be backed by Azure Storage. Many of the data and analytics services are backed by Azure Storage. Even messaging services like Event Hub or IoT Hub, they are also backed by Azure Storage. So it is a major building block of the majority of what Azure provides. In this section, though, we're going to focus on storage from an infrastructure as a service perspective. We're going to talk about what all of the different types of storage are, and we will cover some of the ones that are outside of IaaS, but we're going to focus on the IaaS ones. Then we're going to talk about disks and how they're associated with VMs and how they are actually used within the scope of storage. We'll talk about them from a managed and unmanaged perspective. We'll talk about the different tiers of storage being standard and premium. And then we'll talk about how to actually provide access to storage accounts, how you can limit who has access to them through policies and tokens. And then, of course, lastly, like we did in the last section, we'll finish up by doing a scripting review of everything that we've covered. We'll talk about how to create storage accounts, how to create policies, and things like that, all through the CLI and PowerShell. But in this particular video, what I want us to talk about now is actually what storage is within the concept of Azure, what all is available. So we'll talk primarily about storage accounts, the different types of artifacts that can be placed inside of storage accounts, blobs, queues, files, and tables. We'll talk about Azure disks. We'll talk very briefly about Data Lake Store, as well as some of the other storage types that are available. And then we'll also pull up some of the third-party solutions that are available with respect to storage as well. So let's head on over to the portal and let's take a look at what's there. Okay, so we're in the portal, and I've logged into my new subscription that I created in the last section. And what I want us to do first is take a look at the storage area under navigation and take a look at what all of the services are that Microsoft considers to be storage. So here we are, we're under the storage category. Now, storage accounts we actually talked about very briefly in the last section because it was a service that had to be created in order for Cloud Shell to be used. And you'll notice there's actually two different ones here. There's Storage Accounts and Storage Accounts Classic. And that's because this is actually a new portal. There was an original portal, windows.azure.com, and there was also a old Azure framework called Application Service Management. And Storage Account Classic is what falls under that. And the only reason that that's there is because there are still customers who are using them, and until all customers have moved over to the new versions of storage accounts, they need to make this available for customers to access. Storage accounts we'll dive into in more detail in a second, but let's talk about what else is here. Data Lake Store is going to be primarily used for data analytics, and that's where you're going to be dropping terabytes, petabytes of large unstructured data sets and then performing analytics on top of them. So Data Lake Store is your storage mechanism, but then there is Data Lake Analytics, which you can then use to run on top of the storage and run your analytics queries using many different mechanisms that are available to you. Store Simple device managers are actually on-prem devices, but that have connectivity and integration with Azure. So if you need to be able to keep large amounts of data on premises inside your data centers, you might want to purchase Store Simple devices, but then have some of that data actually propagated into Azure Storage. And that's why you actually have the ability to see them here from within the Azure portal. The next three items are all tied to Operational Management Suite, and specifically Azure Site Recovery and Azure Backup. So in order for those two services to actually function, they have to have a place to store either the backups of VMs or the data disaster recovery images that are being replicated for disaster recovery as a service, which is what Azure Site Recovery actually is. So those three things all fall under that particular category, and they will be covered in the second series of Mastering Azure called Hybrid Operational Management. The last item is import-export jobs. So some customers, when they first come to Azure, have a large amount of data that they need to have available inside of Azure for use in their applications or just for use in their business. But the size of data is so large that they can't just kick off an AZ copy job. And we'll talk about AZ copy in the last video of this section, which allows you to actually copy content between storage accounts inside of Azure or copy from on-prem into Azure. So you could actually sit at your laptop and make a copy of any particular file on your laptop and actually push it up into a storage account. And you could do that via AZ copy or Windows Storage Explorer, things like that. But when that data set size is too large, what Microsoft allows for you to do is actually to put all of that data onto a hard drive. And there are certain hard drive sizes that are available for you to use, and then ship the hard drive directly to Microsoft, at which point then you've created an import job. Microsoft will then take that hard drive and actually connect the hard drive to the Azure framework and do the copy for you, thereby getting the data much, much faster into your Azure storage accounts. And this is just another quick and easy way for customers to get large data sets, and there's a number of different capabilities. So these are all of the basics of storage. Now let's actually start to dive into storage accounts in particular, because that's going to be the basis for infrastructure as a service, as well as Azure disks. But Azure disks are directly, of course, tied to virtual machines. So let's go into storage accounts. And remember, we've got the one storage account that we created for Cloud Shell storage, but let's actually create a brand new one and walk through what the wizard provides. So the first thing is it's going to ask for a name. Now, one thing to be very cognizant of with respect to the name of the storage account is it has to be all lowercase and it has to be all one word. There cannot be any spaces, there cannot be any dashes, any separators of any kind. It has to be all one word and all lowercase. It also has to be unique within the region that you're actually creating the storage account, not just unique in your subscription. And the reasoning for that is because every storage account has a URL that is built on top of it so that users can actually access what's in that storage account in some way, shape, or form. Now, some people will just use SDK access to the storage accounts, but many actually provide HTTPS access to their storage accounts and to the items within it. The deployment model, I mentioned this earlier, Resource Manager versus Classic. If you're doing anything new, always use Resource Manager. The next is going to be account kind. And this is basically saying what kind of data is going to be put into my storage account. If I know it's going to be all blob storage, then obviously choose blob storage. General purpose, though, is the one that actually provides all four types of storage available in the same storage account. So you can actually have queues, blobs, file shares, all within the same storage account, and they can all be leveraged at the same time because they each one have their own web URL for access. I almost always create general purpose because I want my storage accounts to have that capability. The next thing is standard versus premium. We'll go into that in more detail in the next video, but this actually specifies what types of storage based on performance, size, and things of that nature. The next is replication. So storage accounts automatically, by default, have replication built into them. Now, the most common is zone or locally redundant. What this is basically saying is that the storage account will be replicated, and Microsoft replicates by default, provides 3 replicas for every storage account. The zone redundant is each data center or region is split into zones, and it will only replicate within the zone that the storage account sits. Now, this is something that you as a customer do not actually see. It's done behind the scenes. Locally redundant, on the other hand, is saying, look, we're going to do those same 3 replicas, but we're going to do them inside of the region, therefore spreading them out across zones, therefore making them more resilient with respect to your data sets. The next is geo-redundant. Geo-redundant is saying we're going to provide 3 replicas, but we're going to do it in a separate region. Every region has a pair, and that pair is designed specifically for this purpose, for replication. So in East US, for example, its pair is West US. South Central US, its pair is North Central US, and so on and so forth. And this is true across all regions across the world. That means that if you turn on geo-redundant storage or specify the geo-redundant replication, then your 3 replicas, if you were sitting in East US, would automatically replicate over to West US. That means that Microsoft says if East US should ever go offline, then Microsoft will automatically bring up the West US replicas and make them available for use within some period of time once it has determined that East US is down. You also can request that to be done as well. The last one is read access geo-redundant. Now what that says is that not only will the 3 replicas be available in the paired region, so West US, using the example from before, but you also will have access to them. Now by default, normally the replicas are just hidden. They're there, but you can't actually see them or control them. Whereas with read access geo-redundant, the replicas will actually be able to be seen and accessed via URLs, just like you do the ones in the primary region, but only for read access purposes. And each one of these replications has a different cost associated with them. And the one thing I am not going to do in any of these video series is focus on price. The next thing is whether or not secure transfer is required. And what this is basically saying is whether or not, with respect to the storage account, HTTPS should always be the transit used for any data request or upload download of data from the storage account. Basically, this says that you can specify whether or not you want SSL to be turned on for your storage account for all access. Most of my customers, they absolutely do that for security purposes, but you do have that option to specify turning it on or off. The next is your subscription. You happen to have access to more than one subscription. The next item is then resource group. We talked about resource groups in the last video. What resource group do you want to put the storage account in? And then location. Now you'll notice there's a new item here called virtual networks. This is a new feature that's coming. It is not available in every region, hence why I cannot do anything with it. But what we're going to be doing here soon is, instead of storage accounts always having public endpoints, for those customers who are very security conscious, need to make sure that data is not only transmitted but at rest staying within their quote-unquote networks. And of course we'll talk about networks in the next series or in the next section of videos. You actually will have the ability to put a storage account inside of your virtual network, thereby preventing any public access to those artifacts that are stored within, meaning that the public URL will not function anymore for those storage accounts. As I said, this is going to be a new feature, and it's going to be available here very, very soon, and it will also only be available in certain regions, but then of course over time it will become generally available to everyone. So let's go ahead and create a new storage account, and then let's dive into what's in that storage account and take a look at it in even more depth. So I am going to do, and you can see here I'm getting a little checkbox letting me know that the name that I'm using is actually unique within the region. I'm going to specify resource manager. I'm going to specify general purpose. The other thing to mention about general purpose allows for the blobs, the files, the tables, and the queues. It also allows for access policies to be set, whereas blob storage accounts are only specified for blob data. General purpose also will allow you to put disks inside of them, and we'll talk about this in the next video, but there are 2 different kinds of disks. There are managed disks and there are unmanaged disks. Unmanaged disks go into storage accounts. Managed disks are actually separate resources that Microsoft will manage for you, and as I said, we'll cover that in more detail in the next section because it is something to be very cognizant of and important for you to understand. But for this purpose, I'm going to focus on the general purpose storage account. I'm going to leave the performance at standard because that really only applies for when your storage account is going to have disks within them. In this case, we're just looking at it from a testing purpose. So I've got my couple of different resource groups here. I'm going to choose the packed publishing one. I am going to turn on SSL for secure transfer, and I am going to put it inside of East US. This means that for the replication, which I'll set to geo-redundant, anything that gets replicated will be replicated over to West US because that is the paired region. So let's go ahead and click Create. And we now have a new storage account being deployed. My notification is letting me know that the deployment is in progress. It should not take very long, and the deployment has succeeded. So let me clear out this notification. Now you'll notice it did not automatically appear here. I will need to hit the refresh button, but there is my new storage account. So let's click into the storage account and take a look at what all is here. Top area is going to be pretty standard across all resources, and I think I've mentioned that before, but you can get access to the activity log for this specific resource. We can look at the access control policies, the role-based access control for this particular resource, look at tags for the resource, and then diagnose and solve problems. There's a few other things to talk about here on the right-hand side. The first is just this overview area, which gives you information about the data that you entered in when you created this. So the name of the resource group, what the status of it is, what locations, and you'll notice it provides both locations. So these are the two paired regions, letting me know that the performance is standard, that I am using the geo replication. The next thing, I could delete the storage account from here. I could move it to a different resource group. The last one is open in Explorer. Basically what this is allowing you to do is open this particular storage account inside of a tool called Azure Storage Explorer. It is a tool that is created by Microsoft Engineering. It is free, and it does allow you to interact with one or more storage accounts in one or more subscriptions in such a way that you can much easier through a user interface upload, download, and make adjustments to the storage account directly from within the Storage Explorer. And what I'm referring to is actual artifacts that need to go into Storage Explorer. It's a great way for you to upload files, especially if you're working on scripts or images, static artifacts that need to be accessed. Once you're finished working on them on your laptop, you can easily just upload them directly into the storage account and therefore make them available to users or applications. And as you can see, if you don't have the app yet, download it from storageexplorer.com. So go take a look at that. Now, as we scroll down into the storage account, the next thing is you can actually dive into each of the available services for the storage accounts directly from here. So access to blobs, file shares, queues, and tables. And we'll dive into them in a minute. The next thing then is monitoring. So you can see how accessed this particular storage account is over the last 1 hour, 6 hour, 12 hours, and so on. Total number of requests, total egress. You can see there's a problem loading metrics, and it's because there aren't any. Average latency and success percentage. These are the ones that are available to you by default. And of course, all of these are available to be pinned to your dashboard if it's important to you. Now, let's dive into some of these other items. Under settings, we've got a number of different things here. Access keys is what is primarily going to be used when you need to access the storage account via an SDK. You're going to need the storage account name, and you're going to need either one of the keys or the actual connection string, which lets you know what the, matter of fact, let's take a look here, specifying default endpoint, the HTTPS, the account name being pack testing storage, and then it processes the storage key. So this is a connection string that can be used to actually connect to the storage account via one of the many SDKs that are available. But you can also connect to it just using the storage account name and key in some examples, especially if you're doing scripting. The next thing is configuration, and configuration allows you to change the performance tier of the particular storage account. You can also turn on or off the secure transfer, in other words, SSL. You can also change the replication on the fly. The next thing is shared access signature, and we're going to talk about this in more detail 2 videos from now, but this is where you can actually create access policies for the storage account, even at specific service levels. So you can create different access policies for blobs versus files versus queues versus tables, and then allow different resource types to be accessed at different permission levels for different periods of time, and then even specify what IP addresses are going to be allowed to access those particular areas. So this is where you can define public access to your storage accounts for different items. It makes the creation of Azure-based or cloud-based applications much easier and much more controlled. The next thing is firewalls and virtual networks. Right now, this is allowed access from all networks, but you can specify selected networks. And as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the new features that's going to be, or that is available in certain regions, and where you can actually define a storage account to be tied to a virtual network, thereby removing public access to that storage account. And this is where you would select a virtual network. Now, obviously, we don't have any virtual networks yet. That's the next section of videos. But we can go back after that and put this storage account inside of that virtual network. This is extremely important for security conscious customers. Next is metrics. And this is where we can actually turn on metrics for a particular storage account and even look at the metrics on a per service level. So let's look at blobs. And then what metric do we want to look at? We can look at blob capacity. We can look at transactions. Let's look at just transactions. And there, right there, live on the fly, it is going to check for the last 24 hours metric data. Now, this feature is in preview. It'll be generally available here soon, but it is something that you can do. It's very similar to what I showed you in the last section in Azure Monitor, where you can look at, say, CPU utilization on the fly for a given VM. You can actually look at metrics for this particular storage account right here from within the blade. Next thing is properties, and this is just metadata about the storage account that you created. It's very similar to and has many of the same pieces of information that I've already shown you, but what your different public endpoints are, what kind of storage account it is, what the replication is, all of those kinds of things. Remember, there's an item called resource locks we talked about in the last section. This is where you can actually create a resource lock on this particular storage account, and then an automation script. This automation script is a ARM template. Remember, infrastructure as code, which we'll talk about later, but you can actually get a ARM template just for this particular storage account, thereby making it easier for you to create larger ARM templates that need to include this storage account. The next sections are all going to be tied to each of the individual services. So starting from the bottom, and you'll notice down here at the bottom there is a monitoring section as well, where we can turn on diagnostics, we can set up alert rules, and I've covered all of those from the previous video section, but these can all be tied directly to this particular storage account. Now, queues, think of queues as a messaging mechanism. You need to be able to send small, no larger than 256K text messages from one service to another. A queue is a great messaging capability. It does have its limitations, and once you hit those performance limitations, then you're going to move on to maybe service bus or event hubs or IoT hubs, which we'll cover in a different video series. But this is where you're probably going to start when it comes to messaging. And you're going to start by just creating a queue. Once you've got that queue created, you now have a endpoint to actually create that queue. So let me create one here, and I'm just going to call it test queue, and it successfully created that queue. And you'll notice here it is here. I can, of course, delete it by clicking on the checkbox, but it gives me a specific URL directly to this particular queue. Now with that URL, I can actually push messages onto the queue, or I can retrieve messages from the queue. And you can do that either in Azure Storage Explorer with one of the SDKs, or of course with either one of the scripting methods that we've already started covering. I then have the ability to turn on cores for this particular queue, and cores is what allows multiple different domains to be able to talk to this particular storage account. And remember, considering our storage accounts all have a base Azure URL, you're probably going to need to turn on cores rules, especially if you're going to be accessing them from a different domain or an application in a different domain. And then I can look at metrics specific to queues. And right now, there aren't any metrics because nothing's going on, but I can look at some of the same kinds of metrics, but specific to this service. So I'm diving deeper into it. Now, tables, you can think of tables as a NoSQL column-based database, but it's going to be a single table. Now, with a table, you're going to define columns. Not every single column has to have data in it. You're also going to define a primary key and a partition key. And those are going to be what are used for searching purposes within that given table. So if we create a new table, once again, test table, I now have a new table. Now, I can immediately start to add data to that table in whatever columns that I want to. But when I do so, I'm going to also define a primary key and a partition key. Once again, this is something that's going to be primarily used in application development. You're not going to really do a whole lot within the scope of the portal. However, you can open it up inside of Azure Storage Explorer and really start to play around with it, look at the data, manipulate the data, and things like that inside of Azure Storage Explorer rather than having to use an SDK. Next thing is file service. Now, what is file service? File service provides file shares, SMB file shares, for use within Azure applications. And that's very important for infrastructure as a service type applications, because older applications in that paradigm leveraged Azure file share or leveraged file shares in general for configuration file storage, static file storage, just documents in general that needed to be available inside of an application. And this type of service provides that. So you can create a file share. That file share can then be connected to from Windows directly as an SMB file share. It can also be connected to through Linux in a Samba file share. And it would be connected in almost the same exact way, but of course the file endpoint is actually going to sit inside of an Azure storage account rather than on a VM or a server, as would of course be the case if you were doing it on-prem or in a data center. You can also, of course, set CORS rules, just like with all of the other services. You also have the ability to turn on or off encryption specific to this service. And what this basically is saying is not only did we turn on encryption in transit, that was done at the storage account level, but here we're actually saying I want all files to be in this file share to be encrypted. In other words, data at rest encryption. By default, it is turned on. It actually forces you to turn it off. And this particular encryption is Microsoft managed, meaning all keys that are being used for the encryption, Microsoft is managing. Microsoft is doing all of the rotation. In a new feature coming later this year, there is going to be a client managed key capability where a customer can actually create their own keys, do their own key rotation, and manage them either using Azure Key Vault or another key management service of their own. That's something that's coming on along the way. But this allows you to do guaranteed encryption of all files put into your file share. Now, blob. And you'll notice there's a lot more here with respect to blob. And that's because blobs are much more heavily used than any of the other services. Almost every customer has blob storage of some kind. And blobs are actually separated out into containers. Now, it is a completely flat container hierarchy. You cannot create inside of containers, but what you can do is create a container, a folder, off of the main blob service endpoint, and thereby allow you to categorize the blobs that are going to be in your storage account. It also can be used for storage access purposes because you can create different policies for different containers. CORS, we've already talked about. You can actually specify a custom domain for your storage account or for your blob service in particular. And this can help with your CORS rules and help prevent the need for CORS rules in some cases if you want to put on your own domain that the application is actually a part of. Encryption, just like we talked about with the file share, you can actually specify encryption at rest for any blob that's put into the storage account. And you'll notice there is no encryption for queues or tables. If you want to do encryption at rest for queues or tables, the developer will actually have to do that on their own as they're putting the data into one of those two services. That's the way it is currently today. I do believe that that will change in the future. The next thing is Azure CDN. Azure CDN is Azure's content delivery network. So for customers who need to or want to store static images, static video, static audio files that are part of their application, and they want those files to be as performant as possible, what you can do is put a Azure Content Delivery Network on top of the storage account. What this does is it changes the URL or the endpoint to that data, and of course makes that data come from the Content Delivery Network. But the Content Delivery Network automatically propagates copies of that data out across the world to make it much more performant, so that when a user accesses, say, an image or a video file, it's getting it from the closest location to them, rather than having to maybe come all the way back to East US to get it when they might happen to be in Russia. And if you are creating geographically based applications that do need to be accessed around the world, this might be something that you want to do. But this is a quick and easy way to put Azure Content Delivery right on top of your storage account, and specifically on top of the blob service. You can also create a Azure Search service right directly on top of your blob service as well, specifying what content you want to be searched upon. And this is where you know that your blobs are documents, text files, things that can very easily be indexed and therefore full text searchable at some point. If you know that you've got a blob service like that, you can actually back your Azure search mechanism, which is a full text platform as a service search mechanism, right directly on top of that blob service. And then lastly, metrics we've already talked about, and usage, which this lets you see what the capacity of your storage account is, how many containers, how many objects. I point this out because every single service inside of Azure has limits. Now, some of those limits are soft limits, meaning you can put in a support ticket and actually get those limits upped for your subscription. In other cases, though, they are going to be hard and fast limits. Every single service has them, and they can be found inside of the documentation for those services. And then anybody can actually create a support ticket and request that a specific limit be upped for their subscription. Those limits are applied at the subscription level, and they're done at the Azure framework, so you actually can't see them anywhere other than in the documentation. So that is a quick and fairly deep overview of storage with respect to infrastructure as a service. We're going to be focusing on in this video series, though, is blob service. We'll talk about how to create shared access signatures, and we'll talk about, of course, disks, which can be placed into storage accounts or they can be separate. So let's now go back over to the deck, and we'll talk about what's coming in the next video.